Go ahead and call the meeting back to order. Can I get a motion that the closed meeting be closed, and the board certifies that, to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting to which this certification applies, and only such business matters as were identified in the motion concerning the closed meeting were heard, discussed, and considered. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion from Mr. Honeycutt. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second from Mr. Edwards. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Superintendent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Tonight, we have some items, primarily the budget that the Board of Supervisors has now passed and sent back to us to deal with. But since our last meeting, just 2 weeks ago, there have been a few other items that we need to bring to your attention before the end of this school year. One of which is the day after we had our meeting, we got notification that the Title III intent to participate had come out and needs to be passed, and so I've asked Ms. Boswell to come and give a presentation on that. This is federal funding, by the way.
Yes, sir. Good evening, Chairman Sturtevant, members of the board, and Mr. Nichols. For the last 2 years, Mecklenburg County has been a member of a statewide Title III consortium, and Virginia Tech serves as the fiscal lead for that consortium. By May 31st of 2016, we must submit an intent to participate in that statewide consortium again. This intent, as Mr. Nichols said, was not received in a time that we could bring it before you on May 16th. So at this time, I request that you consider this information and vote this evening. And I apologize for that, but that was outside of my control. Are there any questions about this?
Questions, board members? Thank you.
Second, there's some information related to service agreements that we need to clarify, and I've asked Mr. Dalton if he would be available to bring you up to date on these service agreements that you have available through board docs.
Good evening, Mr. Nichols, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I've been uploading these as they came in since Saturday. I'll review over the email that I posted on Saturday morning. I'll review that with y'all real quick, kind of get you up to speed on what we're asking for here. Over the past month, I've been in contact with Moores Mechanical, Southern Air, and Comfort Systems USA concerning proposals for service agreements for the boilers and chillers within the division. The preventive maintenance agreements will cover us for 3 visits a year, which include the following: clean and inspect all equipment in the off-season, boilers in the summer, chillers in the winter; a startup inspection, an operation inspection midway through the season. Any repairs needing to be made that are not covered in these agreements will need to be quoted separately before work can begin. I feel strongly that implementing preventive maintenance programs such as these will make for more reliable equipment, less downtime and school cancellations, plus eliminate a great number of maintenance call-outs. It is my understanding that our boiler internals have not been cleaned or inspected in quite some time. This is why I believe that it is an imperative that we know the integrity of our equipment, especially before entering another heating season. These are not multi-year contracts as we've had in the past. They're annual service agreements with a renewal option at the end of 12 months. Each contractor is a trained authorized dealer, so the ability to service the equipment at South Hill Elementary is not an issue, as Train's contracts on the chillers there ends this year. Chiller number 1 in September the 30th. Chiller number 2 ends, and the controls agreement ends July 31st, 2016. At this time, I would like to recommend that we move forward with Moores Mechanical as our service provider for the above-mentioned services. Moores Mechanical's quote for a 1-year service agreement was the lowest of the 3 quotes I received. They have also included backflow device inspections, what the other 2 companies' quotes did not have in them also. And that will be an action item also tonight. At this time, does anyone have any questions?
Questions, board members? No, thank you.
I also have I'm sorry, Mr. Nichols, go ahead.
Well, were you going on to the surplus?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I was going to continue on to
I
the
was just going to
surplus item.
suggest that we also have more inventory that we are looking to put on surplus, and Mr. Dalton was going to give you an update on that as well.
They were all uploaded today. It's just a few more items to add to our surplus list. Additional items have been added to your board docs for your review, and I would recommend that the board deem these items surplus tonight.
That will be an action item.
Yes,
Any
sir.
questions? Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Finally, members of the board, of course, we have the budget response from the Board of Supervisors. We will have a smaller budget next year, as we have discussed, than we have had this year, that we have to make some adjustments to. I have made recommendations for those adjustments that we've discussed. Basically, the big issue for the budget to be known is that the board did give us the money that they deemed appropriate for the 2% increase in salary for the teachers. We will need to add the benefit package to that salary, but without that, we will not be able to give the increase as expected in retirement. And so I'm going to be asking that you pass the board. It's a categorical budget, and you've been given information by category for the action items. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Any questions, board members? None? Thank you.
And, Mr. Chairman, that's all of the discussion. At this point, it looks like we need to go directly to action.
To the action. Thank you,
That's
Mr.
right.
Nichols. First action item. Can I get a motion that the school board approves the payment of the bills?
So moved.
We have a motion
Second.
and a second. These bills were presented to the Finance Committee. We have a recommendation from the Finance Committee.
Finance Committee reviewed the bills, Chairman, and we do recommend that the board pay the bills as they were presented.
Thank you. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item B, that the school board, get a motion that the school board approves the personnel recommendation.
So moved.
We have a motion from Mr. Honeycutt.
Second.
We have a second from Mr. Campbell. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item C, that the school board approves RFB 2017-1, ground and lawn maintenance contracts to be awarded. Two, that also went through the Finance Committee. What is your recommendation?
Finance Committee did go over this, Mr. Chairman, and we recommend that that contract be awarded to Green Acres.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. That the contract be awarded to Green Acres. Do we have a motion?
Motion to approve?
Motion from Mr. Edwards. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second from Mr. Johnson. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item D, get a motion that the school board approves RFP 2016-1, agreed upon procedures for external audit. The contract will also be awarded to, that as well went through the Finance Committee. Ms. Bailey, you have a recommendation?
Yes, sir. We had one auditor submit a proposal for that, and that would be Cradle, Jones, and Alga. And so the Finance Committee did recommend that we proceed with the external audit with that firm.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. That the award be awarded to Cradle, Jones, and Alga. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion from Mr. Honeycutt. We have a second from Mr. Edwards. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item E, that the school board approves the Title III intent to participate. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion from Ms. Bailey and a second from Ms. Garner. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer? Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item F, that the school board approves the service agreement be awarded to, that's also a finance committee. What is the recommendation?
Yes, Mr. Sturtevant, the Finance Committee reviewed those proposals as well, and we agree with Brian that that award be to Moore's Mechanical.
Motion to approve?
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. We have a motion for Mr. Edwards. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second for Mr. Honeycutt. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Item G, get a motion that the school board deems the inventory item surplus property. Do you have a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion for Mr. Palmer. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second for Mr. Johnson. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. The last action item for tonight, item H, that the school board approves the fiscal year 2017 proposed budget. Do we have a motion?
Motion to approve?
We have a motion for Mr. Edwards. Do we have a second? We have a second for Mr. Palmer. Roll call.
Mr. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Palmer?
Yes.
Mr. Honeycutt?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mrs. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Edwards?
Yes.
Mr. Sturtevant?
Yes. Number 7, item A. It's time for adjournment. Do we have a verbal motion to adjourn? All in
Motion to
favor?
adjourn.
All opposed? Meeting's over. Adjourn.